My name is Evelyn Reed, and I'm 38 years old. For the last 5 years, my life has been a quiet routine of managing my late husband's construction business, a legacy he left me far too soon. I thought honoring him meant taking care of his parents and his sister, providing for them, and enduring their casual cruelty in silence. During our weekly family dinner, my father-in-law, a man I had supported for years, looked me dead in the eye and called me useless. He said I was nothing more than a placeholder in my own husband's company. Seconds later, the dining room doors opened, and my secretary walked in holding a single, unmarked file folder. My in-laws had no idea what was inside that folder. They had no idea that their gravy train was about to come to a screeching, permanent halt. If you've ever felt unappreciated by the very people you sacrifice for, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And before I tell you how that one folder changed everything, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about finding your strength when you've been underestimated. Before that fateful dinner, my world was painted in shades of gray. It had been 5 years since I lost my husband, Michael. He was the architect of our lives, a brilliant and kind man who saw potential not just in dilapidated buildings, but in people. He saw it in me. When a sudden heart attack took him at 42, the vibrant colors of my life seemed to wash away, leaving only the stark blueprint of his construction company, Reed and Sons, and a family that suddenly felt like strangers. Michael was the golden son, the pillar of the Reed family. His parents, Richard and Margaret, had always relied on him, not just for financial support, but for their entire sense of identity. His younger sister, Clara, had built her life in his shadow, coasting on his generosity. When he died, the responsibility of being that pillar fell squarely onto my shoulders. I was a graphic designer by trade, but I had spent years by Michael's side, learning the ins and outs of his business. I knew his vision, his clients, his ethos. Stepping in as CEO felt less like a choice and more like a sacred duty. The company was my last connection to him, and I poured every ounce of my grief and energy into keeping it afloat. It wasn't easy. The first 2 years were a blur of 80-hour work weeks, navigating the skepticism of a male-dominated industry and learning to command a boardroom. But I did it. I didn't just keep the company afloat, I made it thrive. We landed 2 of the biggest contracts in the firm's history, expanding into sustainable urban development, a passion project Michael and I had often discussed late at night. My in-laws, however, saw none of this. To them, my success was merely a continuation of Michael's legacy, not my own achievement. My role was that of a steward, a caretaker, not a leader. And with that perception came an endless stream of expectations. It started subtly. Margaret would call, mentioning that the property taxes on their house were due, and I would quietly write the check. Richard's car needed repairs, a new transmission that cost thousands, and I covered it without a second thought. It was what Michael would have done. Then there was Clara. At 35, she worked a part-time job at a boutique, a position that barely covered her rent, let alone her taste for designer handbags and international vacations. Michael had always subsidized her lifestyle, and she saw no reason for that to change. The calls became a monthly ritual. "Evie, I'm a little short this month," she'd begin, and the conversation would end with me transferring a few $1,000s to her account. This dynamic, this unspoken agreement where I was the provider and they were the dependents, became the foundation of our relationship. It was a foundation built on my grief and their entitlement. A particularly painful memory stands out from a couple of years ago. I had just landed the Northwood Tower project, a career-defining achievement. I was exhausted but exhilarated and invited the family out to a celebratory dinner at a nice restaurant. I spent the first 20 minutes excitedly explaining the innovative green roof design and the community benefits. When I finished, Richard cleared his throat. "Well, it's good to see Michael's plans are still paying off," he said, taking a sip of his wine. He always did have a good head for business. There was no congratulations for me. No acknowledgement of the sleepless nights I'd spent refining that proposal. In their story, I was simply an executor of my husband's will, a stand-in. Clara then chimed in. "Speaking of paying off, that reminds me, Evie. My friends and I are planning a trip to Bali. It's for a wellness retreat, for my mental health. I was thinking a couple thousand would cover the flight. The whiplash was staggering. My greatest professional victory had been reduced to a footnote in their ongoing narrative of financial need. I paid for the trip, of course. I paid because it was easier than facing their pouting, their accusations of me being stingy with Michael's money. Every Sunday, we had dinner at their house. It was a tradition Michael had insisted on, and I continued it out of a sense of duty. But these dinners had become a form of weekly torture. They were a performance where I had to play the part of the devoted daughter-in-law, listening to Margaret's critiques of my management style, Richard's unsolicited business advice drawn from his experience managing a hardware store 30 years ago, and Clara's endless list of wants. They never asked about me, about my grief, about the crushing loneliness that sometimes felt unbearable. They only saw the company, the money, and what I could do for them. I was a function, not a person. A living, breathing ATM that housed the ghost of their son. I was living in a gilded cage, surrounded by the success I had built, but trapped by the expectations of a family that refused to see me. I had convinced myself this was my penance, my way of keeping Michael's memory alive. I thought I could endure their dismissiveness, their constant taking, because it was what a good wife, a good daughter-in-law, was supposed to do. I had no idea that their entitlement had a limit, and that they were about to push me far beyond it. I believed I could maintain this fragile peace forever, but I was wrong. The foundation of injustice was about to crack, and I was the one holding the hammer, even if I didn't know it yet. The event that set the storm in motion arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet, prestigious letter. It was from the American Innovators Guild, a national organization that recognizes excellence in business and architecture. The letter informed me that Reed & Sons was being awarded the Pioneer in Urban Sustainability Award for the Northwood Tower project. It was one of the most respected awards in the industry, a testament not just to the project's success, but to its forward-thinking vision. More than that, the award came with a significant and entirely unexpected prize, a $500,000 grant for future development. When I read the letter, sitting alone in the office Michael had designed, I felt the first genuine spark of joy I'd experienced in years. This wasn't Michael's award. His name was on the company, but the Northwood proposal was mine. I had conceptualized it, fought for it, and executed it after he was gone. The grant wasn't an inheritance. It was a reward for my labor, my vision. It felt like validation, a sign that I was more than just a steward of my husband's legacy. I was building my own. My first thought was of a new project, a passion of mine that Michael had always supported, a nonprofit initiative to build affordable, eco-friendly housing for low-income families. The grant was the exact amount I needed for the seed money. For a fleeting moment, I imagined a future where my work wasn't just about profit margins and steel beams, but about community and hope. That evening, I went to the weekly family dinner with a rare sense of optimism. I decided to share the news, hoping that this tangible, national recognition would finally allow them to see me, to acknowledge what I had accomplished. I waited until after the main course, my heart beating a little faster than usual. "I have some exciting news to share," I began, pulling the letter from my purse. "Reed & Sons won a national award for the Northwood Tower. It's for innovation in sustainable architecture." I handed the letter to Richard. He put on his reading glasses and scanned it, his expression unreadable. Margaret leaned over his shoulder. Clara, for her part, was busy scrolling through her phone. "The Pioneer Award," Richard murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "Michael always talked about wanting to win one of these." He handed the letter back to me, his tone flat. "Good. It will look nice in the office lobby." Margaret nodded. "It's important to keep the company's reputation up. It reflects well on Michael's memory." There it was again, Michael's plans, Michael's memory. It was as if I were an invisible conduit through which his posthumous achievements flowed. The joy I had felt just hours before began to deflate, replaced by the familiar ache of disappointment. "There's more," I said, forcing myself to continue. "The award comes with a $500,000 grant for the company." That got Clara's attention. Her head snapped up from her phone, her eyes wide. $500,000? As in cash? "It's a grant," I clarified. for future projects. A sudden, predatory gleam appeared in their eyes. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The polite disinterest was gone, replaced by a focused, calculating energy that was almost palpable. "Well, isn't that wonderful?" Margaret said, her voice a little too bright. "All that hard work of Michael's, still providing for us even now. I was thinking of using it to start a nonprofit housing initiative." I started to explain, but Richard cut me off. "A nonprofit?" he scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Evelyn, this is a business, not a charity. This is an opportunity. A real one." Clara leaned forward, her expression intense. "He's right. $500,000, that's life-changing. We could finally fix the roof on this house properly. And Dad's retirement fund has taken a hit. We could shore that up. And I've been thinking about finally going back to school for my MBA. They weren't just suggestions. It was a feeding frenzy. In the span of 30 seconds, they had already mentally carved up and spent every last dollar of the grant money. My dream of the nonprofit evaporated in the heat of their greed. I tried to steer the conversation back, to explain my vision, but it was like trying to stop a tidal wave. They weren't listening. They were planning. I left their house that night with a knot in my stomach. The initial reaction I had seen the calculating gleam. The immediate assumption that the money was theirs to spend was a red flag I could no longer ignore. This wasn't just a matter of them being ungrateful anymore. This was something different, something more dangerous. The award and the grant had acted as a catalyst, transforming their passive entitlement into an active, aggressive greed. I had a terrible feeling that this was only the beginning, and I didn't know if I had the strength to fight what was coming. The weeks following the award announcement were a masterclass in psychological warfare. My in-laws had always been demanding, but now, with the scent of a significant sum of money in the air, their behavior escalated from passive entitlement to a relentless, multi-pronged assault on my autonomy. The battle for the $500,000 grant had begun, and I was the only one on the defensive. The first incident was subtle, a classic move from Margaret's playbook of guilt and manipulation. She called me midweek, her voice laced with a carefully constructed tremor of worry. "Evelyn, darling, I was just speaking with our neighbor Mary, her son, you know, the stockbroker. He was telling her about a wonderful investment opportunity, something about a tech startup. He said it's practically a sure thing. I was thinking, a small investment from that grant money, say $50,000? It could double in a year. It would be a wonderful way to secure our future, just as Michael would have wanted." When I hesitated, explaining that the grant had stipulations and that I needed to review them, her tone turned cool. "Oh, I see. Of course, you must be very busy. It's just, with your father-in-law's health, a little security would go a long way. But don't worry about us." The call ended, but the message was clear. My caution was being framed as a betrayal of Michael's desire to care for them. The second incident came from Clara, and it was far more direct. She ambushed me after a yoga class, a glossy brochure in her hand. "Evie, you have to see this," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. It was a proposal for a high-end interior design consultancy. Her name was at the top in a swirling gold font. "This is my dream. All I need is the startup capital. $150,000 should do it. It's a loan, of course. I'll pay you back once the business takes off." I stared at her, dumbfounded. She had no experience, no business plan beyond a few pretty pictures, and a history of abandoning projects the moment they required actual work. "Clara, that's a lot of money," I said gently. "A business needs more than just capital. It needs a detailed plan, market research." Her face hardened. "So, you're saying no? I should have known. You get one big win and suddenly you're looking down on the rest of us. Michael would have supported my dream. He always believed in me." She snatched the brochure from my hands and stormed off, leaving me standing on the sidewalk, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. She had twisted my practical advice into a personal attack and, once again, used her brother's memory as a weapon against me. The third and most galling incident involved Richard. He showed up at my office unannounced one afternoon. My secretary, a wonderfully protective woman named Diane, tried to run interference, but he brushed past her, insisting it was urgent family business. He closed my office door and sat down, his expression grim. "Evelyn, we need to talk about the direction of this company," he began, as if he were a majority shareholder. "This nonprofit nonsense is going to be a drain on resources. I've been looking at some land development opportunities out past the suburbs. It's a bit of a gamble, but the payout could be huge." He slid a crudely drawn map across my desk. "We'd need to liquidate the grant and probably take out a small business loan, but if this pays off, we'll all be set for life." He wanted me to risk the company's financial stability, the very legacy he claimed to care so much about, on a speculative venture he knew nothing about. I explained as calmly as I could the principles of risk management, of fiduciary duty. "Richard, my job is to ensure the long-term health of this company, not to gamble with its assets." His face turned red. "Your job? Let me tell you something about your job. You're sitting in that chair because my son put you there. That's his name on the door. The money, the grant, it all comes from him. You're just managing his estate. And frankly, I'm beginning to question your judgment." I tried to have a calm, rational conversation with all of them during the next Sunday dinner. I came prepared with a presentation, outlining my vision for the nonprofit, showing how it would enhance the company's reputation and fulfill a community need, all while being fiscally responsible. I thought if they could see the plan, they would understand. They let me speak for about 5 minutes before the interruptions began. "It's too idealistic," Richard said. "But what's in it for us?" Clara asked. "I just don't think it's what Michael would have focused on," Margaret concluded, delivering the final, decisive blow. "They weren't just disagreeing with my business plan. They were invalidating my right to have one. My voice, my vision, my 5 years of back-breaking work meant nothing. I felt utterly defeated. The next day at work, Diane found me staring blankly at my computer screen, the budget projections for the nonprofit blurred by unshed tears. She quietly closed the door and sat down across from me. "Mrs. Reed," she said gently. Diane was in her late 50s, a woman of quiet dignity who had been Michael's secretary for a decade before becoming mine. She had seen everything. "I'm going to overstep my bounds here, but I can't stay silent any longer. I saw how they treated Michael, too." I looked up, surprised. "They loved him," she continued, "but they bled him dry. His sister's tuition, his parents' mortgage, he never said no. He once told me, 'Diane, it's easier to write the check than to fight the war.' He was tired, Mrs. Reed. And what they are doing to you now, it's the same pattern, only you're not their blood. They don't even feel the need to pretend to be grateful." She leaned forward, her eyes full of a fierce loyalty that I hadn't realized I had. "They see you as an obstacle between them and what they believe is their money. This isn't a disagreement. This is a siege, and you need to decide if you're going to surrender or if you're going to fight back." Her words hit me like a physical blow because they were the truth. I had been trying to negotiate peace with an army that had already declared war. They weren't going to be reasoned with. They weren't going to suddenly see my value or respect my decisions. This siege would only end one of 2 ways, with my complete capitulation or with their total defeat. The thought was terrifying, but for the first time it also felt liberating. The fog of obligation and guilt was beginning to clear, and I could see the battlefield for what it was. I just didn't realize how ugly the final battle was about to get. The breaking point, the moment that transformed my simmering resentment into a cold, hard resolve, came during a Sunday dinner in late autumn. The air was crisp outside, but inside the Reed family home, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. For weeks, I had been deflecting their requests and demands for the grant money, offering polite but firm responses about due diligence and strategic planning. Their frustration was mounting, and I could feel it coiling in the silence between the clinking of silverware. Richard had been drinking more than usual, his face flushed. Margaret was pointedly ignoring me, directing all her conversation towards Clara, who was radiating an air of smug impatience. They had clearly coordinated their efforts, and tonight was intended to be the final push. The ambush began over dessert, a store-bought apple pie that Margaret served, with a sigh, commenting on how she no longer had the energy for baking like she used to when Michael was around to appreciate it. It was a petty, targeted jab, and I ignored it. Richard set his fork down with a loud clatter. "Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge about to deliver a sentence. "We've been patient. We've given you time to come to your senses, but this has gone on long enough. This family has needs, and you are sitting on a solution. As I've explained, Richard," I began, keeping my voice steady, "the grant is a corporate asset, and I have a responsibility to use it in a way that benefits the company's mission. The company's mission is to provide for this family," he boomed, slamming his hand on the table. The dishes rattled. "That was always Michael's first priority. Something you seem to have forgotten." "I haven't forgotten Michael for a single second," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. The accusation felt like a knife twisting in a wound that would never heal. Clara jumped in, her tone sharp and accusatory. "Really? Because it seems like all you think about is your little pet projects and getting your name in magazines. You're building your own empire with our family's money." It's not your money, Clara," I stated, looking her directly in the eye. "I earned that award. I earned that grant." Then came the words that shattered everything. Richard leaned across the table, his eyes narrowed into slits, his voice dripping with a contempt so profound it felt like poison. "You earned nothing," he hissed. "You were a decent enough wife for Michael while he was alive, I'll grant you that. But now, you're just a seat warmer, a glorified secretary playing CEO. You're a placeholder, Evelyn. And frankly, without Michael's name and Michael's money propping you up, you're useless." Useless. The word hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. It was the culmination of 5 years of being overlooked, undermined, and devalued, all distilled into a single, brutal syllable. It wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of my fundamental worthlessness in their eyes. I wasn't a daughter-in-law, a CEO, or even a grieving widow. I was an object, a tool that was no longer serving its purpose. In that moment of ringing silence, something inside me broke. It was the part of me that had kept trying, the part that held on to a foolish hope that one day they would see me, that my efforts would be enough. I looked at their faces, expecting, perhaps, a flicker of remorse. I saw none. Margaret was nodding in agreement with her husband. Clara had a small, triumphant smirk on her face. They believed it. They truly believed I was useless. My own shock was so profound that I couldn't speak. I felt a strange detachment, as if I were floating above the scene, watching a movie about someone else's life. I saw myself sitting there, small and silent, and I felt an overwhelming surge of pity, not for them, but for myself. For the woman who had allowed herself to be treated this way for so long out of a misplaced sense of duty. The bickering continued around me, but I didn't hear it anymore. The word useless was echoing in my head, and with each echo, it wasn't breaking me further. It was forging something new. It was forging steel in my spine. My bung-tain moment wasn't a flash of anger. It was a moment of absolute, chilling clarity. Diane was right. This was a siege, and surrender was no longer an option. They had just fired the final, unforgivable cannonball. My duty was no longer to them, or even to the version of Michael they had constructed to justify their greed. My duty was to the real Michael, the man who had loved and respected me, and my duty was to myself. I finally understood that honoring him didn't mean enabling his family's toxicity. It meant living the full, independent, and purposeful life he had always wanted for me. As Richard was launching into another tirade about my incompetence, the sound of the front doorbell echoed through the house. Everyone paused, surprised by the interruption. "Who could that be at this hour?" Margaret muttered. I didn't answer. I simply stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. I looked at the three of them, their faces a mixture of confusion and annoyance, and for the first time, I felt nothing but a cold, clean certainty. Their power over me was gone. The spell was broken. They just didn't know it yet. The real war was about to begin, and I was finally ready to fight. As I walked towards the front door, the confused silence of my in-laws at my back, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. The useless comment hadn't just been an insult. It had been a key, unlocking a door inside me that I had kept bolted shut out of grief and obligation. Behind that door was not weakness. but a meticulously prepared arsenal they knew nothing about. My secret weapon wasn't just money or power. It was the truth, and it had been given to me by Michael himself. I opened the door to find Diane, my secretary, standing on the porch. She was dressed not in her usual office attire, but in a smart, dark pantsuit. She held a simple, unmarked manila file folder in her hands, her expression professional but with a hint of the fierce loyalty I had come to rely on. "Diane," I said, my voice even. "Thank you for coming. You have the documents?" "Everything is in order, Mrs. Reed," she replied, handing me the folder. I turned and walked back into the dining room, the folder held firmly in my hand. Richard, Margaret, and Clara were now standing, their expressions shifting from confusion to suspicion. "What is the meaning of this, Evelyn?" Richard demanded. "Who is this woman?" "This is Diane Holloway," I said, placing the folder on the dining table with a soft but definitive thud. "She was Michael's executive assistant for 10 years, and she has been my indispensable right hand for the last 5. And she is here tonight as a professional witness." The folder was my declaration of war, and its contents were the ammunition Michael had left behind to help me win it. What my in-laws never knew, what I had never told a soul, was that in the last year of his life, Michael had seen the writing on the wall. He saw their escalating demands and their casual disregard for me. He was a brilliant man and a meticulous planner, not just in business, but in life. Worried about what would happen to me if he were gone, he had started to prepare. His weapon was twofold. First, knowing his family's obsession with the business, he had quietly worked with his lawyers to restructure the company's ownership. He had converted a significant portion of his majority shares into a private trust, with me as the sole, unchangeable trustee and beneficiary. He also added a specific clause to the corporate bylaws, a key person provision, stating that in the event of my removal as CEO for any reason other than gross misconduct proven in a court of law, the trust's shares would be immediately liquidated, and the funds transferred to a charity of my choosing. In essence, he had made it impossible for them to wrest control of the company from me without destroying it completely. The company and I were inextricably linked. But his second weapon was far more personal and far more powerful. A few months before he died, he sat me down in his study. He looked tired, a weariness in his eyes that I now understood was not just from work. He handed me a sealed envelope. "Evie," he had said, "I hope you never have to open this, but if things ever get difficult with my family after I'm gone, this is for you. It's my voice when I can't be there to defend you myself." I had put the envelope away, unable to contemplate a world where he was gone. I had forgotten about it until Diane's words in my office had shaken me from my stupor. After she left that day, I had gone home and found the envelope tucked away in his desk drawer. Inside was not just one letter, but 2. The first was a handwritten letter to me, filled with his love and his fears for me, urging me to live my own life and not let his family's demands extinguish my light. The second was a formal, notarized statement, addressed, "To whom it may concern." In it, Michael detailed, with the precision of a legal brief, the complete financial history of his support for his parents and sister. He had included copies of checks, bank transfers, and loan agreements he had made them sign, and then never enforced, totaling well over $1 million over 15 years. He documented their sense of entitlement and his growing concern that they viewed his love and generosity not as a gift, but as an obligation. But the most devastating part was a small USB drive clipped to the statement. It contained a video. It was of him, sitting in his study, speaking directly to the camera. He looked healthy, vital, making the content all the more heartbreaking. He explained the corporate restructuring. He explained the financial documents. And then he spoke to his family. He spoke of his love, but also his profound disappointment. He told them he knew they would likely try to control me and his assets after he was gone, and that he was taking these steps to protect me from them. It was his final testament, a clear-eyed assessment of his family's character and a powerful, posthumous defense of his wife. After Richard's useless comment, my path was clear. I called Diane and asked her to retrieve the corporate documents from the office safe and the notarized statement from our lawyer's office, where Michael had sent a copy. She was to bring them to the Reed House at 8:30 p.m. sharp. My plan wasn't just to defend myself anymore. It was to launch a counteroffensive so decisive it would end this war for good. I would use Michael's own words, his own meticulous planning, to dismantle their entitlement piece by piece. Back in the dining room, I opened the folder. "You've all been very clear about what you believe you are owed," I said, my voice devoid of the tremor it usually held when I confronted them. "You believe this company, this money, is yours by right. You believe I am merely a placeholder." I slid the first document across the table to Richard. It was the summary of the company's new ownership structure and the key person clause. "This document might be of interest to you, Richard. It outlines the current ownership of Reed and Sons. You'll notice that forcing me out would trigger the dissolution of Michael's controlling shares. In short, if I go, the company goes with me." I watched as he read it, his face paling, his blustering confidence beginning to crumble. This was just the first shot. The real cannon was yet to come. I had their full, undivided attention, and I was just getting started. The dining room, once a theater for my weekly humiliation, had become my courtroom. I was no longer the defendant. I was the prosecutor, and the folder in front of me contained all the evidence I needed. Richard stared at the corporate ownership document, his jaw working silently as the implications sank in. Margaret and Clara looked back and forth between him and me, their confusion quickly turning to alarm. "What is this trickery, Evelyn?" Margaret finally sputtered, her voice shrill. "Michael would never do such a thing. He would never risk his own family's legacy. On the contrary," I said calmly, "he did this precisely to protect his legacy. He knew that his true legacy wasn't just a collection of buildings. It was a company built on integrity and vision. A vision he was afraid he would tarnish." I then took out the second set of documents, the notarized statement from Michael, along with the damning financial records. I laid them on the table, fanning them out like a poker player revealing a royal flush. "And this," I announced, "is Michael's accounting of that legacy, the real one." I passed a copy of the summary page to each of them. It was a single sheet of paper that listed, in stark black and white figures, the total amount of money Michael had given them over the years, the down payment on their house, the loan for Richard's failed business venture, the European study abroad trip for Clara that was little more than a 6-month vacation, the cars, the allowances, the endless bailouts. The grand total at the bottom was staggering: $1,274,350. Clara gasped, snatching the paper as if it were on fire. "This is a lie! Where did you get this?" "I didn't get it, Clara." Michael compiled it himself. "Every check, every bank transfer, it's all here." I gestured to the thick stack of supporting documents. He wanted a record. He wanted the truth to be known, just in case. Richard was speechless, his face a mottled shade of crimson. He had built his identity on being the patriarch, the self-made man, but the paper in his hand told a different story. It painted him as a man propped up, for decades, by the son he now claimed to be channeling. "He did it because he loved you," I continued, my voice softening for a moment. "He did it because it was easier than seeing you struggle. But he also saw that his generosity had become an expectation, that you had started to see his support not as a gift, but as your birthright." Margaret started to cry. Not the manipulative tears I was used to, but genuine, broken sobs. "We loved our son," she wept. "How can you say we were just using him?" "I'm not saying it, Margaret," I replied gently. "Michael Island," and with that, I took out the final piece of evidence, the USB drive. He also left a personal message. He wanted you to hear it directly from him. I walked over to the small laptop I had asked Diane to bring in and set up on the sideboard. I inserted the drive and turned the screen to face them. A moment later, Michael's face filled the screen. He was in his study, the afternoon light streaming in behind him. He looked healthy, handsome, and so achingly alive it stole my breath. The room was utterly silent as his voice, a voice I had longed to hear for 5 years, filled the space. "Mom, Dad, Clara, he began, his expression serious but kind. "If you're watching this, it means I'm gone. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the pain you must be feeling, but I'm also sorry that I've allowed things to get to a point where this video is necessary." He spoke for 10 minutes. He spoke of his love for them, recounting fond childhood memories. Then, his tone shifted. He calmly and methodically explained the financial documents. He talked about his disappointment when he realized they saw his success as their own personal treasury. "I have given you everything I could," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I see now that in doing so, I failed to give you the one thing you needed most, the opportunity to stand on your own feet." Then, he looked directly into the camera, and it felt as though he were looking right at me. "And that brings me to Evelyn," he said. His entire demeanor softened. "She is the best thing that ever happened to me. She is not just my wife, she is my partner. She is brilliant, she is capable, and she has worked just as hard for the success of Reed and Sons as I have. The company is as much hers as it is mine." He turned his attention back to his family. "I know you. I know you will try to control her. You will try to make her feel small, to make her feel like an outsider. You will try to take what you think is yours, which is why I have taken these legal steps. They are not here to punish you. They are here to protect her, to give her the freedom to live her own life, to make her own choices without the crushing weight of your expectations." He paused, taking a deep breath. "The money? The house? The company? None of it matters as much as her happiness. So I am asking you, as my final wish, to let her go. Let her be happy. Respect her. See her not as my replacement, but as the incredible woman she island." Oh well. The video ended. The screen went black. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence filled with shattered illusions and devastating truth. Richard had sunk into his chair, looking like a man who had aged 20 years in 10 minutes. Margaret was weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Clara was staring at the blank screen, her face a mask of shock and shame. They had been confronted not by me, the useless placeholder, but by the sainted son and brother whose memory they had so cynically weaponized. His words were irrefutable. His disappointment was undeniable. Their entire narrative, their entire justification for their behavior, had been obliterated by the one person they could not argue with. I stood up, my hands steady. The long, grueling war was over. "The weekly dinners are finished," I said, my voice clear and strong. "The financial support has ended. From now on, our relationship, if there is to be one, will be on my terms. You are welcome to call me, but you are not welcome to make demands. The grant money will be used to launch the Michael Reed Memorial Housing Initiative, a nonprofit dedicated to building affordable homes." I looked at each of them, seeing them not as monsters, but as flawed, broken people now stripped of their power. "Michael asked you to let me go," I said softly. "And now, I'm letting you go." With that, I turned and walked out of the dining room, leaving them alone with the ghost of their son and the deafening silence of the truth. Walking out of that dining room felt like walking out of a prison. I didn't look back. Diane was waiting for me in the foyer, her expression a mixture of concern and pride. She simply nodded, and we left together. That night, for the first time in 5 years, I didn't drive back to the large, empty house that felt more like a monument to my in-laws' expectations than my own home. I checked into a hotel downtown, ordered room service, and slept for 10 uninterrupted hours. It was the most profound peace I had ever known. The immediate aftermath of the showdown was a deafening silence. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing from Richard, Margaret, or Clara. No angry phone calls, no tearful texts, no surprise visits. It was as if they had vanished. This silence was a gift. It gave me the space to breathe, to process, and to begin the monumental task of disentangling my life from theirs. My first act of liberation was putting the family home, the house Michael and I had shared, on the market. It was a beautiful house, but it was haunted by too many ghosts and too many painful memories of those Sunday dinners. It sold within a month to a young family, and I felt a sense of relief watching them, knowing the rooms would be filled with new laughter, free from the weight of the past. With the proceeds, I bought a modern, light-filled condominium in the city, overlooking the harbor. It was smaller, sleeker, and entirely my own. I designed the interior myself, filling it with clean lines, bold art, and comfortable furniture that was chosen for my joy, not for appearances. It was my sanctuary, a physical representation of my new, unburdened life. Professionally, things moved forward with breathtaking speed. Free from the constant need to justify my decisions, I poured all my energy into the company. I officially announced the launch of the Michael Reed Memorial Housing Initiative, using the full $500,000 grant as seed money. The project was met with widespread acclaim from the city and the industry. We broke ground on our first 20-unit affordable housing complex within 6 months. Seeing the foundation being poured on that site was more fulfilling than any corporate contract I had ever signed. Of course, the initial absence of my in-laws did not mean they were without their own struggles. The first sign of trouble came through the grapevine. A distant cousin called to mention that Clara had been fired from her boutique job for poor attendance and a bad attitude. Without my monthly allowance to fall back on, she was reportedly in a panic, trying to find a roommate to help cover the rent on her overpriced apartment. The Bali wellness retreats were a thing of the past. Then, about a month after the showdown, I received a stiff, formal letter from Richard's attorney. It was a clumsy, desperate attempt to challenge the corporate structure, claiming Richard had been a silent partner in Michael's business and was owed a share. My lawyer responded with a single letter, attaching a copy of Michael's notarized statement and the video transcript. We never heard from Richard's attorney again. The cost of that failed legal gambit, I later learned, forced them to take out a second mortgage on their home. The financial safety net I had provided for years was gone, and they were feeling the cold, hard reality of its absence. They were finally being forced to live within their own means, a concept that was utterly foreign to them. I didn't take pleasure in their struggles, but I also didn't feel guilt. I felt a quiet, detached sense of consequence. They had made their choices, and now they were living with them. My choice was to move forward. I started reconnecting with my own friends, people I had neglected out of exhaustion and obligation. I took a vacation, my first in 5 years, to Italy, where I sketched architecture and ate gelato without having to check my phone for a family-related crisis. It was during this period of rebuilding that I realized how much of myself I had suppressed. I had been living my life according to a script written by others. The script of the grieving widow, the dutiful daughter-in-law, the tireless CEO. Now, for the first time, I was writing my own script. And while the future was uncertain, it was also filled with limitless possibility. It was a blank page, and I held the pen. The dawn of my new life was breaking, and the light was brilliant. 10 months after that final, explosive dinner, my life was unrecognizable in the best possible way. The pale gray existence I had been enduring, a life lived in the long shadow of grief and obligation, had been replaced by a world saturated with vibrant color and a profound sense of purpose. The condominium I had bought was more than a home. It was a declaration of independence. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the bold, abstract paintings I'd collected, and the thriving fiddle-leaf fig trees I'd finally found the time and peace of mind to nurture. Every object, every color, was a choice I had made for myself, and that simple fact brought me a quiet joy I hadn't realized was possible. Reed and Sons was flourishing beyond my wildest dreams, and it was doing so with a new, revitalized soul. The Michael Reed Memorial Housing Initiative had become the core of our identity. We had just completed our first housing project, and the day we held the key ceremony for the first 20 families was, without a doubt, the proudest and most meaningful moment of my career. I remember handing a set of keys to a young single mother named Sarah, who had been living in a shelter with her 2 small children. She held the keys in her palm and just stared at them, tears streaming down her face. I never thought we'd have a real home again," she whispered. In that moment, watching her daughter run to peek into her very own bedroom for the first time, all the past pain, all the fights and the insults, they all seemed to shrink in significance. This was why I fought. This was the legacy I was building. The initiative had also transformed the company's public profile. We were no longer just another successful construction firm. We were a community partner. The change attracted a new generation of talented, idealistic architects and engineers who wanted their work to matter. Our brainstorming meetings, once dry discussions of profit margins, were now buzzing with innovative ideas for community gardens, shared workspaces, and energy-efficient designs. I was no longer just running my late husband's company. I was leading a movement, and it was the most fulfilling work of my life. My relationship with my in-laws had settled into a new, strange, and distant reality. They had not, as I half expected, faded away completely. Instead, after months of a brittle, wounded silence, they had resurfaced, fundamentally changed and humbled by the harsh realities they now faced without me as their safety net. Clara was the first to reach out. The phone call came one rainy Tuesday evening. Her voice was small and hesitant, stripped of its usual sharp edge of entitlement. She had lost her overpriced apartment and was living in a tiny studio across town, working two demanding service jobs, one as a waitress and another in retail to barely make ends meet. The most shocking part of the call was that she wasn't asking for money. She was, to my astonishment, calling to apologize. "I've had a lot of time to think, Evie," she said, her voice cracking with an emotion I'd never heard from her before. Genuine remorse. When you're on your feet for 10 hours straight, and you still have to choose between paying your electric bill and buying groceries, it really changes your perspective. I never understood what real pressure was. I just thought I was entitled to an easy life because Michael had one. She confessed that she had started therapy. "My therapist says I built my entire identity around being Michael's golden-haired sister. And when he was gone, I tried to transfer that dependency onto you. It was parasitic. It was wrong. And I am so, so sorry, Evie. For every cruel word. For every demand. For everything." It was a raw and honest admission, and it disarmed me completely. I accepted her apology, cautiously. We didn't magically become best friends overnight, but a fragile bridge had been built over the chasm of our past. I began inviting her for coffee once a month. Our conversations were awkward at first, but for the first time, they were about our actual lives. She asked for my advice on creating a budget. She told me about a difficult customer at the restaurant. She was learning, slowly and painfully, to be an adult. I saw a flicker of the woman she could be, stripped of the toxic entitlement that had defined her for so long. Richard and Margaret's transformation was more subtle, born from the slow grind of necessity. With their finances in disarray after the failed legal challenge, they had been forced to sell their large family home the very stage of my weekly humiliations and downsize to a small, generic condo in a retirement community. The shock of their diminished status had been profound. Richard, a man who had so freely dispensed his unsolicited business advice, was now working a part-time job at a local garden center to supplement their social security. They invited me to dinner at their new condo. The space was cramped and impersonal, a stark contrast to the home that had been filled with their history. The meal was simple, one Margaret had cooked herself. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken words, but the suffocating tension of the past was gone. They asked me about my life, about the housing initiative, and for the first time, they actually listened to my answers. "We saw you on the local news last week," Richard said, looking down at his plate. He seemed to have shrunk, the blustering arrogance replaced by a quiet weariness. "For the ribbon cutting on that building. Michael, he would have been very proud of that." It wasn't the eloquent apology Clara had offered. It was grudging, steeped in his own pride. But coming from him, it was a monumental concession. It was an acknowledgement. It was recognition. He was finally seeing me, Evelyn Reed, not just the widow of his son, not just a placeholder. The justice that was served wasn't a dramatic courtroom victory or a public shaming I had orchestrated. It was quieter, more organic, and far more profound. It was the simple, unavoidable consequence of their own actions. Stripped of the financial and emotional buffer I had provided, they were forced to confront themselves, their choices, and their true circumstances. They had to learn to be self-sufficient, a lesson Michael had tried, and failed, to teach them with kindness. Life, it turned out, was a far harsher, but more effective teacher. My own life, meanwhile, was expanding in ways I hadn't dared to imagine. I had reconnected with my own circle of friends, joined a hiking club, and even started dating casually. There was a kind architect from a partner firm who made me laugh. A man who was interested in my ideas and my future, not my past. It was nothing serious, but it was a beautiful reminder that my story wasn't over. My life as Michael's wife had been a beautiful, cherished chapter, but it wasn't the entire book. The new boundaries with my in-laws were firm and clear. Our relationship was cordial but limited. There were no more obligations, no more entanglements. It was a relationship slowly being rebuilt on a new, fragile foundation of respect. They had to earn their place in my life, and they were, slowly and awkwardly, beginning to try. They had lost their power over me, and in doing so, had inadvertently given themselves the chance to find a different, more authentic way of being in the world. The useless placeholder had become the architect of her own destiny, and in a strange twist of fate, had forced them to finally start drawing up their own blueprints as well. As I stand here today, in the sunlit lobby of the very first building completed by the Michael Reed Memorial Housing Initiative, I often reflect on the turbulent journey that brought me to this peaceful shore. This building, filled with the vibrant sounds of children playing and neighbors sharing morning coffee, is more than just brick, steel, and mortar. It's a living symbol of resilience. It's a testament to the idea that, from the deepest chasms of grief and the most painful betrayals, you can build something beautiful, lasting, and strong. The most profound lesson I learned throughout this ordeal was not about business strategy or architectural design. It was about the fundamental nature of value. For 5 long years, I had outsourced the definition of my own worth. I allowed it to be dictated by the roles they assigned me: the good widow, the dutiful daughter-in-law, the silent provider. My value was measured by my utility to them, by my capacity to endure, to sacrifice, and to absorb their casual cruelty without complaint. I mistakenly believed that by erasing myself, by making myself smaller, I was somehow honoring my husband's memory. But I was profoundly wrong. The moment my father-in-law leaned across that dinner table and spat the word useless at me was, ironically, the moment I began to understand my true worth. He meant it as poison, as the final, killing blow to my spirit. But in that moment of absolute clarity, I found a way to turn his poison into my antidote. The word didn't define me. It freed me. It severed the last chain of obligation that bound me to their toxic expectations. My worth was not, and had never been, in my utility to them. It was in my vision, my perseverance, my integrity. It was in my ability to take a legacy of love, complicated by a legacy of grief, and transform it into safe, beautiful homes for people who needed them most. I came to realize that Michael's final gift to me wasn't his company or his money. It was the unvarnished truth. In his final words on that video, he gave me the tools to see the situation with his clear eyes, and he gave me his unequivocal permission to fight for myself. He knew that true love doesn't demand servitude. It champions freedom and celebrates strength. Honoring him didn't mean preserving a toxic status quo. It meant evolving, growing, and becoming the person he always knew I could be. Through this, I learned that boundaries are not the aggressive walls you build to keep people out. They are the sacred foundations you lay to protect the home that exists within yourself. They are not an act of hostility, but an act of profound self-respect. The first time you set a real boundary with people who are used to walking all over you, it will feel like an earthquake. The ground will shake, and you will be terrified. But then, when the dust settles, you will find yourself standing on more solid ground than ever before. You teach people how to treat you by what you are willing to accept. For years, I had accepted disrespect, and in return, I was served a steady diet of it. When I finally found the courage to say no more, the entire dynamic of my world shifted. The path forward wasn't easy, and it wasn't a straight line. It required confronting people I had once considered my closest family, navigating painful truths that had been buried for years, and stepping into a future that was entirely my own, which was both terrifying and exhilarating. But every difficult conversation, every sleepless night spent wrestling with doubt, was worth the unshakable peace I have today. A peace that comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what you will no longer tolerate. So, I want to ask you, have you ever had a moment, a word, or an event that forced you to completely redefine your own worth, separate from the expectations of others? What did that journey look like for you? And how did you find the strength to start building on your own foundation? Please share your stories in the comments below. I read every one. And your experiences create a powerful community, reminding us all that we are not alone in these struggles. If this story resonated with you and the journey we've taken together, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about overcoming challenges and reclaiming your power. Remember to share this video with someone who might need to be reminded that they are the architect of their own life, and they are anything but useless. Thank you for listening. Look at the roles you are playing in your own life. Are they roles you chose, or roles that were assigned to you? It is never too late to demand a rewrite. May you always have the courage to build a life that is truly, beautifully, and unapologetically your own.